The unique Melody 3DT is an interesting earphone in many different ways. Despite being a hi-fi earphone, this one is clearly on an entirely different level. The housing is made of a mix of stabilized wood and acrylic resin. The carrying case is a collab between unique Melody and the Korean brand Dignis, and the driver setup is triple dynamic drivers on each channel. Yeah, there are a lot of cool things going on here, but how good are they in practice? That's what we'll find out. This is Earphoneus Fanaticus, and in this video, I'll present to you my detailed review of the unique Melody 3DT Terminator. Let's start with physical design. The 3DT uses a shell that's very similar to custom IEM. I think Unique Melody might be one of the first brands to use custom-like fit for universal IEMs, don't quote me on that, but traditionally, earphone that uses such a design gives the best seal and comfort in my opinion, and the 3DT is no exception. Yeah, it looks very chunky, and this is definitely not one of those earphones that you can just put into your ears and forget about, but it can really block out noises just by being big enough to completely cover the concha. However, I think the Mass Drop Plus, which is also designed after the custom-like fit, blocks out even more noises because it uses a longer nozzle, but some might prefer the 3DT's shorter nozzle because it should in theory be less irritating to the ear canal. Shorter nozzle also has the advantage of allowing more space for sounds to travel, so the earphone can sound less congested and more spacious. Anyway, the 3DT is very comfortable to wear thanks to the form-fitting shape of the medial side, and despite its big housing, I can wear this for hours without issue. If you've never tried earphones like this before, you've got to really try one yourself. The fit and seal just can't be beat. I bought an older Unique Melody earphone in Japan called the Maverick back in 2016, and 5 years later, it is still one of the most comfortable earphones in my collection. Speaking of the Maverick, let's do a comparison to see how much changed in the past 5 years. From this view, we can see that the Maverick is a little bit boxier, while the 3DT is curvier, and the nozzle is tilted away more than the Maverick. This doesn't really change the comfort and seal for me though, so I have no idea why Unique Melody decided to change the shape. Aesthetically, the shell has a very unusual design. Being one of the other Hong Kong special edition of the 3DT, it is made of pieces of stabilized wood mixed with acrylic resin. On first sight, the earphone is very beautiful and smooth looking until you start looking closer at the wood pieces. While the faceplate of the right earpiece looks quite intact, the left earpiece has a clear crack that looks more like an accident than intentional design. Looking at the back, the craftsmanship is a little better, but on the right earpiece we can still see bits and pieces of wood. Maybe this is actually very hard to do right. When looking at these official images, I expected the stabilized wood to be done much better, but at least when I sweep my finger across those cracks and those broken off pieces, it feels very smooth to the touch. Speaking of the images, I also didn't expect the blue parts to be so dark colored. Not sure if this is down to individual variants, seeing that on DMA Audio's website, they do mention that these are all supposed to be uniquely made, meaning you're not going to find the same pattern on any of the other 149 pairs. Yes, they only made 150 pairs in total for this variant. But if you're interested in this earphone, you can find the 3DT in other shells as well. For instance, I think these Japanese versions look even more sophisticated and prettier than my Hong Kong version, but you do have to be physically in Japan in order to buy those, and you're probably not going to find them anywhere else. There's a vent port on the faceplate, which is not surprising given that the 3DT does use 3 dynamic drivers in each earpiece. Yup, you heard me right, 3 dynamic drivers. Here's how they're arranged. There's a 10mm CNT dynamic driver responsible for the mids and highs, CNT standing for carbon nanotube by the way. This driver fires into an acoustic tube which also mixes sounds from 2 7mm dynamic drivers which are responsible for the bass and sub-bass. This is such an interesting design because normally multi-driver earphones use balanced armatures instead of dynamic drivers, and when dynamic drivers are used in a multi-driver design, it's usually in a hybrid setup with BAs mixed in as well. Dynamic drivers are a lot bigger than BAs, and even if this sort of design might be completely ridiculous and might not actually give better sound, at least if the manufacturer wants to, they can experiment with it just because the housing is so freaking big. Of course, I was very intrigued by this design too, and that's why I bought the 3DT in the first place. I'll tell you how this setup performs later in the sound analysis section. The 3DT uses a big 6mm wide nozzle that is basically a metal cylinder with a mesh inside. Very chi-fi indeed. Normally for a multi-driver earphone, you would expect there to be multiple bores as well, but since the sounds from all the dynamic drivers are mixed into a single acoustic tube, you can probably forget about vertical layering, the illusion that sounds are coming from different heights in the headspace. It uses 2-pin connection just like any other earphones. The socket is nicely carved out, and the connection to the 2-pin cable is very secure. The cable uses metal wired ear guide, which is my preferred style because it is adjustable and doesn't fall off the ear unlike cables without any ear guide, though on this one, I think the ear guide could have been cut shorter because with it being so long, it's actually quite easy for it to get tangled up. The conductor used is silver-plated copper, and that's the reason why the cable is all silver looking. There's a transparent choker, but just like the ear guides, this is cut too long, so initially it was not as smooth as the choker on my Maverick, but with use it got smoother. I also think that they should have used colored choker because I found that I actually do have to look for it because it's transparent while the cable is so light colored. Moving on down, the Y split is just heat molded, which I don't mind because it helps to reduce weight and cable noise as it rubs against clothes. The 2 channels turn into a quad braid from here on out, and it terminates with a right-angled 3.5mm jack, which to me is more preferable over straight-angled jacks. Overall, the cable is very lightweight, flexible, and easy to handle. I just wish the choker and the ear guides were shorter. Let's talk about technical specs. Frequency response is rated to range from 20 to 20 kHz. Not high res, but this is really all you need. Impedance is rated at 25.4 ohms, which is between the usual 16 to 32 ohms for IEMs nowadays. Because only dynamic drivers are used, you probably shouldn't have to worry too much about the 1/8 rule. Sensitivity is rated at 113 dB, and once again, we see another manufacturer that doesn't give a proper unit. Is this dB per milliwatt or dB per volt? Through some calculations and volume matching, I think this is actually dB per milliwatt. So here's how it fares compared to other IEMs. Wow, look at it all the way at the top. It even surpasses the Maverick at 111 dB per milliwatt. So this earphone must be crazy easy to drive, right? Well, yeah, it is actually quite easy to drive, but compared to the Maverick, which has a slightly lower rated sensitivity but twice the impedance, I found the 3DT is actually slightly softer. While this could be attributed to measurement error, a simpler explanation would just be the fact that the Maverick is flatter in the mid-range compared to the 3DT, and as I've said time and again, the mid-range is very important because it basically makes up most of the music we hear. So when the mids are recessed, music is just going to get that much softer. Besides, sensitivity is by convention measured at 1 kHz, but 1 kHz sine waves aren't exactly what music is. Therefore, we have to be careful about how we interpret sensitivity rating. Sensitive earphones are also said to be more unforgiving in terms of source hisses, and when plugged into my Cord Mojo, which is connected to my desktop PC and a power strip, I do hear some faint electrical noises, but at least with my Onkyo DP-X1A, I don't hear any hisses even when charging. Let's check out the accessories. Why don't we start with this beautiful case? Even though this is Unique Melody branded, it is actually manufactured by a Korean company called Dignis, which is very well known for making all sorts of leather cases for DAPs. If you're into the hobby, there's no way you wouldn't have heard of this before. To have international collabs like this is one reason why Unique Melody is so different from your typical chi-fi brands. Anyway, I think Tin Hi-Fi already did an exceedingly good job with this leather case that comes with their T4 earphone, but look at this one, just no competition at all. I love the colors on this case. The navy blue, the cyan, the dark blue, they all look so nice together. I also like the fine diagonal ridges because they make the case grippier. The zip also uses the same leather material as the case, and it is quite smooth to operate if only a little scratchy. Under the top lid, we can see a silky smooth pocket, and in the main compartment, there's this divider that's actually quite a pain to use. I still haven't figured out how to use it, and my solution is just to take out the whole thing and use the case as an empty box. I mean, look at how convenient this is. It's so roomy inside that even with my thick boy 22 AWG cable, there's still plenty of room for another pair of earphones. Yeah, I'm not really a man of sophistication. Anyway, even though there isn't much cushioning inside, at least the cloth material should be able to protect the 3DT from scratches. The box is quite stiff and it doesn't get distorted easily under normal pressure, aside from the top lid sinking down because of the zip. Overall, this is a gorgeous case that also has some nice usability to it. Now, if you like this case as well, unfortunately you can't buy it separately, but at least you can still buy these beautiful leather cases from Dignis, which cost about $50 to $60 at least here in Hong Kong. The earphone also comes with 4 pairs of silicone tips. I think these are better than your typical Chi-Fi tips, but they're still not as soft as stuff like SpinFit or Spiral Dot Plus. Design-wise, unlike the Tin Hi-Fi T4 or the Blanc BL01, these aren't actually SpinFit knockoffs. And that's not surprising because unlike most of these smaller Chi-Fi brands, Unique Melody actually does sell worldwide through channels more official than your Linso or AliExpress or what have you, so not infringing copyrights is important to them. For instance, if you're in Japan, you can actually walk into Yodobashi and buy a pair of Unique Melody earphones, Yodobashi being a major retail chain specializing in all sorts of consumer electronics, appliances and much more. This is exactly the reason why I kept saying in my Tin Hi-Fi T4 or Blanc BL01 reviews that if those brands want to grow bigger on an international level, they need to start respecting what modern civilization values as well. And if they don't want to respect that, they might as well just stay within China forever. But coming back to the tips, for some odd reasons they seem to have included 2 of the same size, so instead of getting 4 sizes of tips, I only got 3 sizes to choose from. Not a huge problem personally, but that might be something you want to pay attention to if you do plan on buying it. The earphone also comes with this smooth cloth for wiping away dust, but that's pretty much it for all the accessories. You don't get any other cleaning tools or flight adapter, and there are only just a few sizes of tips to choose from. The accessories might feel a little bit anemic, but at least the Dignis case kind of makes it all up. But as we all know, what truly justifies the price of an earphone is the sound quality. So at $330, how good does the 3DT sound? In the following section, I will talk about different aspects of sound performance of this earphone. My auditioning setup consists of the Onkyo DP-X1A as the source, log range adjusted +2, and digital filter set to sharp. Besides local files, I also use an app called USB Audio Player to play back Tidal music, as well as my PC Chord Mojo setup for tests like bass rattling and perceived dynamic range. As for the earphone, I'll be testing it with the stock tips in medium, and I'll also be pairing it with my recently purchased Effect Audio Aries 2 Plus cable in order to take advantage of the balance output on my DP-X1A, which gives lower distortion. Now, even though I'm not using the stock cable, you shouldn't have to worry about there being significant differences in sound signature or sound quality. Sure, the Aries 2 Plus is all copper and very thick, but the only difference will come from me using balance output, not from inherent sound changing characteristics of the cable. So, here we go. Let's start with the bass. Although the minimum frequency given by the manufacturer is 20 Hz, I can actually hear all the way down to 15 Hz at normal listening level. This ranks the 3DT at the same position as the Blanc BL01 which I reviewed last time. I'm actually going to review the numbers shown here very soon because I now have a better way of doing this test, but at least 15 Hz for both of these earphones is accurate. When doing frequency sweeps, I noticed that 40 Hz already feels quite strong, and getting into the 70 to 100 Hz range, the bass feels very loud and visceral, and then it sounds like the volume stays relatively constant towards 250 Hz. Despite the strong bass tuning, I don't hear any fluttering sounds even at high volume, so Unique Melody definitely took the driver's limit into consideration. To me, I think this range feels quite like what I heard with the BL01, except the mid-bass is more subdued and the rumble comes from lower bass registers, aka the sub-bass. Because of this, I find the bass less distracting or annoying relative to the mids. Now, even though the sub-bass is very easily audible, I think it is surprisingly nimble considering the amount of bass you're getting, and it doesn't feel the firmest either. Sometimes earphones that use balanced armature drivers can sound too punchy when tuned to be bassy, but that's not something I feel here, which might be attributable to the dual dynamic driver setup responsible for the bass and sub-bass in this earphone. That being said, when I compared it to the Sony MDR EX1000's bass quality, I find that the EX1000 sounds warmer and more relaxed while the 3DT sounds a bit uptight. not to mention the EX1000 seems to have a slight edge in terms of bass detail despite it feeling looser. I'm not sure how much of this is due to the differences in technical performance between the EX1000's humongous 16mm driver and the dual dynamic driver setup of the 3DT, but I would guess sound signature plays a bigger role here. While personally I prefer the EX1000's presentation more, you might like a tighter bass, but if I was unique melody, I think the bass can still be tuned out a little bit, especially the sub bass for a more natural transition from the mid bass. Next, let's move on to the mids. Here, I always like to make a comparison with my UERR because in my opinion, it is the earphone that gives the best mids in my earphone collection. Beginning with lower mids, I think cello isn't all that rich coming from the 3DT, even though there should be enough response from lower registers to sort of create reverberation and masculinity, but at least the bowing texture is quite good. The 3DT also gives very clear vibrato as vocal fades, and I think it can definitely give my UERR a run for its money in this regard. I don't have any major complaints for male vocals, except I would prefer it to stand out just a little bit more. However, I have more issues with female vocals. They can often sound a little bit bright and unnatural as a result of the upper mid elevation, so it is more likely for female singers to sound electronic and artificial. The UERR, on the other hand, is smooth and nuanced, especially when it comes to the details in the singer's breathing. Now, some people might actually prefer 3DT's brightness, especially for short listen, but I can guarantee in the end, the UERR will always be more listenable for longer session. When stepping back for a broader examination of the whole range, there's definitely a strong sense of mid-recess, and I have some concrete examples to illustrate why this is a big problem for me personally. I listen to classical music quite often, especially orchestral work, so having a sense of big sound and space is very important. I don't want my Symphony No. 5 of Beethoven to sound like chamber music, and one key thing that makes sure this doesn't happen is by not having a V-shaped or U-shaped signature. Unfortunately, that's exactly what the 3DT is, and so when listening to the theme Andantino Moderato from Rhapsody in Blue, the whole presentation is not as atmospheric as the UERR with its mostly flat mid-response, and listening closely, I find the piano to sound less permeating. It's almost like there's not enough room for the notes to spread out. Switching to O Fortuna, the UERR sounds wider and it feels like there are more people singing. It sounds more majestic and grand, so the 3DT loses another round. If I try Poco Allegretto by Brahms, once again I find UERR's rendition to be superior. The strings are smoother, denser, and as a whole the piece feels wider, more expansive. I'm kind of running out of adjectives here. Well, if orchestral works don't jive well with this earphone, what if we tried something less complex, like a piece with nothing but a piano? Well, UERR wins again for having stronger emphasis on harmonics, while the 3DT makes it thinner and somewhat electronic sounding, which is definitely not all that lifelike to a real piano. If I try violin solo, 3DT makes the instrument blare out more and again electronic feeling. There just isn't an occasion where the 3DT wins when it comes to classical music, and the reality is, this is not the first time I've noticed it when it comes to Chi-Fi IEMs. The Tin Hi-Fi T4, the Blonde BL01, and now this. Maybe this is what people like nowadays, but to me, I'm under the impression that most Chi-Fi brands or people who like V or U-shaped signature don't listen to this genre. And if you belong to this crowd, the only major problem you should worry about is the thin and at times piercing female vocals. Let's see if the 3DT does any better with treble response. When doing frequency sweeps, the maximum I can do with this earphone is actually 20 kHz, but more confidently at 17K, so that's what I am reporting here in this chart. This doesn't present the highest frequency I can hear, but rather the highest that I can hear reliably. From here, 16 to 15K already sounds quite loud, and this is maintained towards 14K, but rises soon at 13K. 12 to 11K forms a very loud peak, and unfortunately, this is where I can hear channel imbalance tilting to the right at 11K. Finally, there's a rise from 9 to 8K, which is basically present in all IEMs. But what does it all mean? Well, I'm glad to report that cymbals have good decay, no smearing and no shifting in pitch that I experienced from the BL01. I also don't feel like there are percussions missing, which points to a good balance of treble peaks. I really have nothing to complain about here, and I'm sure this must be a breath of fresh air for you all after my long rant on the mids. But rant more I will, because I think the treble is ruined by upper mid elevation, and if that's not present, treble will be crispier and airier. For now, the high registers are tinted by a grain of aggressiveness. I keep saying that I want crispy and airy treble for most IEM reviews these days, because I'm still waiting for something that sounds like the Unique Melody Maverick to come to my life. Give me something better so I can stop talking about that earphone, damn it. But overall, despite the fact that this range is handled by a 10mm driver, I don't see any major downfall compared to BA, which is typically thought to be better suited for playing back treble for its supposed speed. So good job, Unique Melody. Let's move on. Next section is going to be on Soundstage and imaging. Beginning with Soundstage, I think the 3DT has a very wide soundstage, and the reason is simply because of the sheer height of the housing. This allows Unique Melody to place the 10mm driver farther away from the bore, and that driver is the one that handles mids and highs. However, I have to say that the JVC FW1800, which is my benchmark for this category, still trumps it. This is likely due to the fact that the FW1800 doesn't have a long nozzle unlike the 3DT, and the driver is probably tilted slightly off axis. Imaging is loose with the 3DT, so instruments often sound like large smears rather than well-defined sources of sound. Horizontal layering is acceptable, but I think there should be more spaces between sounds for better separation. In terms of verticality, the soundstage of the 3DT is not just wide. It is also quite tall, but for some reason it is not the most spacious feeling ever. This is probably due to the fact that all the drivers have to share the same outlet, unlike IEMs such as the Maverick, which dedicates separate boards for each driver, so there's no physical separation of different sounds vertically. In other words, there's basically no vertical layering to speak of. Thankfully, as demonstrated by the 3DT's ability to adequately present the bowing texture on stringed instruments, texturing of sound is quite good indeed. Overall, the 3DT only excels in soundstage width and texturing, but is quite average in pretty much everything else. How important these things are will largely depend on how you listen. Are you a close listener, or are you more of a casual who just wants music as you go about your day? If you are the latter, sound signature should always be your first consideration instead. Let's also touch on dynamic range. A larger dynamic range means that it's easier for you to hear faint sounds or sections in the music. With the 3DT, I'm able to reach 60 dB max, but at such level I can only hear the sibilance, and for me the true dynamic range would be 48 dB, at which I can still hear the melody if only faintly. I report max dynamic range here, and in reality, how much you're able to achieve effectively would depend on how quiet your listening environment is, the volume you play the music at, how well the earphone seals up your ear canal, etc. Not only that, I did this test by ear, not by machine measurement, so only take this with a grain of salt. That's all for sound analysis. Next, let's talk about ear-tip matching. With a 6mm wide nozzle, the 3DT is definitely a bit of a big boy, and any tip that has a somewhat non-stretchy core is not going to fit this earphone. Anyway, these are all the tips that I have, and this time I have two tips that I want to recommend. The first one is the SpinFit CP500. I always like going with a shallow fit with these tips, and this time is no exception, but this also means you get less isolation as now the earpiece is not 100% up against your ear. However, I have to say that if I go for a normal fit, the tip actually seals worse, as this tip has a lot of material in its flange, and inside the ear canal the upper flange would actually bunch up rather than creating a uniform circular seal. So for me, shallow fit is a necessity. Anyway, when going for a shallow fit, the CP500 can weaken the bass and make the treble less in your face. This is good, as this should make the 3DT better for long listens. Usually ear fatigue happens when there's too much upper mids, but I find that if the bass is too strong it can actually get a bit fatiguing as well as your listening time goes on. I also think that shallow fit is better for orchestral work as the head space feels bigger, and so you wouldn't have that feeling where a piece of music that's supposed to sound like it's being performed from a big stage becomes like chamber music. Now what about the other SpinFit models that I have? Normally, I think SpinFit tips are in general good replacement for the stock tips, but this time I find that most of the other models match quite badly with the 3DT, as cymbals will actually become lower pitched. I think this is mostly due to a mismatch in the size of the opening of the earphone and the tip, but CP500's opening is large enough to avoid that problem. Now if you don't actually want the sound signature or even the overall sound quality to change, but you're just looking for something that's comfier, you should get the Spiral Dot Plus because the flange is softer relative to the stock tips, and the opening is still big enough to not make treble sound different. But otherwise, you don't really get any significant change to the sound quality. This honestly feels like a very weak reason to buy new tips, and so if I were you and I don't have these tips already, I wouldn't bother buying them unless you have other earphones that you want to try these tips on. Let's draw an end to this review. For $330 US, what do I think of the Unique Melody 3DT? Well, I think this earphone is a pretty good purchase, but it's certainly not perfect. Starting with physical design, while I like how comfortable and form-fitting this earphone is, the gimmick of using stabilized wood to make the housing can be executed better. Some wood pieces seem to have broken off during molding, and you really can't convince me that places like these are intentionally created rather than just an accident. I also think the blue is a bit darker than expected, but we all know how different cameras produce different colors. When diving into sound quality, I find the 3DT to have in general a V-shaped signature which emphasizes the bass and the treble. I like how the mid-bass is tuned, but personally, the sub-bass is too strong relative to the mid-bass, meaning any transition between these two ranges would feel a little unnatural. I also think the bass can sound a little bit uptight, and this probably has something to do with how the mid response is tuned. I think there's a general trend towards V-shaped signature for IEMs nowadays, and while that's great for creating fun bass and elevated upper mids, as someone who listens to all kinds of genres, from rock, hip-hop, metal to electronic music and classical music, I like something that's more generalist than fun-sounding. Yeah, the 3DT has subjectively more enjoyable bass and brighter upper mids, as well as treble when compared to my go-to IEM, the UERR, but they aren't balanced well against the mids, so you do lose some emphasis on the melody, the vocals, and any nuances that are associated with the mid-range. One thing I find problematic time and again is that when listening to orchestral work, I feel like the sound I'm getting is not big enough or wide enough. Now, I'm not talking about Soundstage. The stage is there, and it is very wide, but it is not filled up with the correct assortment of sounds that I would otherwise get with earphones that strike a better balance between the different ranges. Granted, we are talking about IEMs here, so you aren't supposed to be getting big sounds to begin with, but being able to do things that are hard to get with regular earphones is precisely what sets a true audiophile earphone from the crowd. And we aren't even talking about anything crazy here. All I want is for the mid-range to be brought up more, so that I don't have to agonize over what music to listen to with the 3DT. Besides, by virtue of the big housing and the multi-driver setup, the 3DT already has a good foundation for producing big sound, so why rob it of this quality with the recessed mids? Now, I'm not saying this earphone sound bad per se. In fact, I think most of you who have the chance of trying out this earphone will find it quite enjoyable. But again, I do like a very broad range of music, so I need something that will sound great with everything that I listen, and the 3DT is not that. As for the triple dynamic driver setup, it sounds super cool on paper, but in practice, I don't see what's so special about it. All the sounds are mixed into the same tube, so it's hard for me to tell apart the drivers, and I don't get vertical layering, a feature that should be easy to achieve had they went with VA and separate boards instead. This is quite disappointing for me personally, seeing that the Maverick, which is from the same company, is the most spacious earphone I have, and is also the only one that's able to clearly achieve vertical layering. I thought being from the same brand, the 3DT would be able to achieve something similar, but I guess at the end of the day, you can't beat limitations imposed by physical design. Besides, separate drivers are typically used when you want to play a certain bandwidth with enough volume without distortion. But there are also many single driver earphones that can do exactly that, and it's not like you're supposed to be blasting your ears 24/7 anyway. So A+ for creativity and novelty, B or B- for actual sound quality, I guess. Accessories wise, while the ear-tips are just decent, I have to once again praise Unique Melody for collaborating with Dignis to create such a beautiful case. It's so nice looking and textures that I just can't help looking and touching it. It's spacious yet easy to pack because of its shape, and the small level of rigidity that it has means you don't have to worry about the earphone getting squished in your backpack. Good looking and functional, what's not to love? Well, seeing that a regular Dignis case in Hong Kong is priced at around $50 to $60, we can see a big chunk of the $330 price tag is coming from the case, not to mention we are talking about a custom design here. And quite frankly, I'm not sure if the case is enough to justify the current price tag. I think the 3DT would be a much fairer purchase if priced at around $200 to $250. But otherwise, this is going to be it for this review. If you found it useful, don't forget to like and share the video. And if you have any question, please let me know in the comment section. If you have this earphone, I would also love to know what you think of it. Anyway, I'll come back with yet another earphone review. Hopefully I will see you again in the next video. Goodbye, friends.